thought I pushed it, but we are an environmental learning center, and our mission is to connect people, communities, and the natural world. So we have two different programming that we have: youth programming and community program. So this is part of the community programming, and I do a lot of the youth programming. And we've had our first program last Thursday, and then we had to cancel a couple programmings due to the smoke. So we're hoping that things clear so that we can have programming, since all of our programming is outside or mostly outside. So before we begin, I would like to go over a land acknowledgement. And this land acknowledgement was created alongside the Shimpish people. We are spreading the message they wish to be shared to the public. The land Wenatchee River Institute sits on is the ancestral homelands of the Shimpish, Pisquosa, or Wenatchee people. The Shimpish, meaning people in between, had villages positioned along the Wenatchee River and surrounding areas. Their ancestral homeland extends from the Cascade Ridge throughout what is now known as the Wenatchee or Okanagan valleys. The culture and economy of the Shimpish people center on the taking care of the land. They fish, hunt, gather roots and berries, basket-making materials, and medicines. The Shimpish are named within the Yakima Treaty of 1855. Language to establish the Wenatchee Reservation was never followed through, even with the needed surveying completed. Many Shimpish now live on the Colville Reservation, 150 miles northeast of Leavenworth. They were forced off their land here, and the U.S. government moved them to this reservation. The Shimpish people are still alive today. They continue to practice their culture, harvest their traditional foods and medicines, and hold their ceremonies passed down from their ancestors. Most people won't see or notice them, but they continue to be on the land they are connected to. Their traditional language is Inhamchin, an interior Salish dialect, and we would like to welcome you all by saying hello in their language. Tilhusht. We offer this land acknowledgement as the first step to amplifying Indigenous voices and recognizing the harm done to them as a people. We stand as an ally to recognize their connection to the land and their rights to practice their culture on these sacred lands. We encourage all to learn about the Indigenous peoples of the place you now call home. The Wenatchee River Institute is committed to sharing this land acknowledgement and following up with other actions to educate and be respectful. I'd like to acknowledge our sponsors for the evening. And we have, for the whole season that we have, these are our sponsors that you'll recognize many of them: Gustav's Grill and Beer Garden, Ludwig's German Restaurant, Obertal Inn, Posey Handpicked Goods, South Restaurants, Hotel Pension Anna, Munchin House, Sleeping Lady Mountain Resort, North Central Washington Audubon Society, and Icicle Brewing. Those all gave $500 plus to help with these events. And then we have other ones: the Cove Resort at Fish Lake, Culture Consignment, Riverfront Rock Gym, and Mountain Home Lodge. So thank you so much. And if you go to any of these places, you can thank them as well for helping to contribute to our events here. We have a couple of upcoming events here. We have in 2 weeks, September 28th, another author, Timothy Connor, is going to be sharing about his book, Beautiful Wombs, and it's a search for solace and light in Washington's channeled Scadlands. So join us for that. And we are also starting our autumn ambles. So if you know of any guests that are coming, or as a local and you want to go on the riverfront trails looking for salmon, those are starting September 29th, and you can look online for those. And then we also have a cool event October 1st at Chelan Ridge, and it's on Hawk Watch. So it's a traveling field trip. So that will be on a Saturday for, I think it's like 8 to 4. So we have limited spaces for that because everyone has to fit into our otter van that says Wenatchee River Institute. So those are some upcoming events. And now I'd like to welcome our star for the evening is Iris Graville, and she writes nonfiction, including personal essays, memoir, and profiles. Her work has been published in national or regional journals and anthologies. Iris is also the publisher of the online Shark Reef Literary Magazine. Her third book, the memoir Hiking Naked, by Homebound Publications in 2017, received a Nautilus Book Award. In 2018, she was named the first writer in residence for the Washington State Ferries system, drafting essays as the vessel coursed along the state's San Juan Islands. Writer in a Life Vest, Essays from a Salish Sea was the result, published by Homebound Publications in March 2022. An environmental activist and a retired nurse, Iris lives with her husband on traditional Coast Salish lands, now called Lopez Island in Washington. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Iris up here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dee, so much. And let's check to make sure that I'm unmuted. Is that okay? Well, thank you all for being here tonight. And thank you to all the folks at the Wenatchee Wenatchee River Institute. I have writer on my mind. Actually, writer in residence, I abbreviated to WRI, and this is WRI, the Wenatchee River Institute. So I've been getting them all reversed frequently over the weeks of preparing for this. I also want to thank Gracie, who's here from A Book for All Seasons, and both to her and Stephen for their support and being here this evening to sell books. And welcome to everyone there in the virtual land, as well as folks who are here, and looking forward to sharing with you this evening. I'm going to begin tonight, as I do all of my events and as I do in the book, with another land acknowledgement. I acknowledge I reside on the ancestral lands and waters of Coast Salish peoples who have called this place home and cared for it from time immemorial. I wrote these essays on traditional lands and waters of Coast Salish tribes. I express my deepest respect and gratitude for these original and current caregivers and healers of this region. I also acknowledge the disposition of Indigenous lands was often taken by coercive and violent acts and the disregard of treaties. I regret the harm done to First Nations people by colonizers, of which I'm a part. For that, I extend sincere apologies, and I pledge to work toward reconciliation. So this evening, I'm going to read some excerpts from Writer in a Life Vest. And my dear friend, Jackie Haskins, is going to join me in reading one of the essays, and then we'll have some time for conversation. So I'll begin with just reading an excerpt from the book's introduction to lay the groundwork. As an islander, I spend considerable hours on the Salish Sea, sometimes in a kayak, but primarily on the Washington State Ferries, the largest ferry system in the nation and third largest in the world. The fleet carries nearly 25 million people a year through some of the most majestic scenery on Earth. While ferries are my connection to the mainland, the inter-island route travels among only 4 islands in the San Juans: Lopez, Shaw, Orcas, and San Juan. Over the years, that circuit has supplied time and space for me to write. During the spring of 2017, my concerns about climate change in general and the health of the Salish Sea in particular grew. I wasn't alone. People throughout the islands and indeed the world were becoming increasingly aware of the threat of ecological disasters. I'd studied the effects of warming waters and sea level rise. I knew southern resident killer whales, also known as orca whales, neared extinction due to toxins and plastics in the water, vessel noise, and a 60% reduction in their main source of nutrition, Chinook or king salmon. I'd seen evidence of sea star wasting. I'd read that 30% of birds and 38% of mammals are listed as threatened, endangered, or candidates for these designations. I'd written agencies and government officials to urge them to prevent the risk of spills from increased oil transit. I became certain it was time to focus my writing on protecting and preserving the water and life that surrounded my home. Doing some of that writing while drifting on the Salish Sea would undoubtedly influence and enhance my work. Thoughts of a year-long writing residency on the inter-island ferry surfaced as a way to do my small part to protect this ferocious, fragile place. I floated the idea with a retired ferry boat captain and member of the Ferry Advisory Committee. He encouraged me to develop a proposal and submit it to a contact of his in the Washington State Ferries system. My proposal outlined the overall goal, a book-length collection of personal essays. I anticipated exploring history and details about the inter-island route and the MV Tillicum, the vessel in service at that time for the inter-island circuit, and describing the Salish Sea and the effects of climate change on it and southern resident killer whales. The structure of the inter-island residency was simple. I planned to walk, not drive, onto the ferry on Lopez Island with my laptop, journal, and research materials, and then ride, write, and read along the route. There would be no cost to me or the ferry system. The inter-island is the only route that allows walk-on passengers to ride free. From August 1st, 2018 until August 30th, 2019, I served as the Washington State Ferry System's first writer-in-residence on the inter-island ferry. A crisp white table tent with my name in black lettering and the WSF logo in blue identified me and my role. It took far longer than one term to complete this book, but many pieces had their beginnings at a table on the MV Tillicum, floating, sometimes pitching port to starboard, past rocky shorelines, snowy mountain ridges, forests of cedars, firs, and madrones, mansions, and mobile homes. Seagull and eagle calls, briny wind currents, and tingling sea breezes stimulated my senses. This is a collection of nonfiction essays, written not by a scientist or marine biologist, but by a storytelling lover of the Salish Sea. Most of the essays are in a form sometimes referred to as lyric. I used techniques of both prose and poetry to explore topics I might not otherwise approach and to lead readers to ask questions. I offer them as symbols of resilience, inspiration, and hope. So as I was working on this project, I really grappled with the fact that I was a concerned resident. I wasn't a scientist. I wasn't a marine biologist. And I really struggled with whether or not I had anything to say that was going to be of use or would be helpful. And I had so much to learn, and my feelings about the threats to the Salish Sea are really deep, as they are for many people. And there aren't any easy solutions. So I really wrestled and questioned what was my work to do, or if it was my work to do. And whenever I had big questions, I usually write about them. So for this collection, I decided to use a variety of forms. It's different from my previous book, which is a narrative prose memoir. These were all essays. Most of them are quite short, and some of them fall in the category of flash nonfiction, which is very short, hybrids, genre hybrids, among others. And I'd been studying and experimenting with these different forms, and I thought that this subject matter might really lend itself to some different forms, and that would, maybe provide some other ways to share some very difficult information, as well as to, maybe provide some different venues for these short pieces. One of the things that I was learning a lot about was the Salish Sea. Even though I've lived on the Salish Sea for close to 30 years, I realized just how ignorant I was. And Words are my medium, but I was learning so much of the statistics and the numbers related to the Salish Sea. And I felt that I needed those numbers along with the words to try to convey how we need to keep an account of what's happening to the Salish Sea. So I wanted a piece that would be really strong visually as well as imparting this information. So the piece I'm going to read now is that one. It's called Salish Sea Account, and it is one that really lends itself more to a visual, because each line or short paragraph of the piece begins with a numeral as opposed to a word. And I scattered in some definitions from the dictionary too. I think it's a form that kind of conveys all that I was trying to make sense of about the Salish Sea. So it's called Salish Sea Account. It begins with an epigraph by Greta Thunberg. Every single person counts, just like every single emission counts, every single kilo, everything counts. Account, noun, report, story, log, tally, balance sheet, debt. 7,000 square miles, the total marine area of the Salish Sea. These inland waters include Washington State's Puget Sound, the Strait of Juan de Fuca, the San Juan Islands, and the Strait of Georgia. 8 million people live and work beside the Salish Sea. 76 southern resident killer whales, or orcas, live in J, K, and L pods in the Salish Sea as of 2/18/21, down from 86 when they were first listed as endangered in 2005. And now that number is 74 southern residents. 30 Chinook salmon are typical in an orca's daily diet. J35, also known as Tahlequah, is a 20-year-old orca whose newborn calf survived for only 30 minutes on 7/24/18. 17, the number of days Tahlequah carried the 400-pound body of her dead calf through the sea. 1,000 miles, the distance Tahlequah traveled the Salish Sea with her pod while pushing her dead calf. On account of, owing to, due to, as a consequence of. 3 main threats to southern residents: insufficient salmon, toxic water, noise pollution. 4 dams on the lower Snake River impede Chinook salmon migration to breeding habitat. 130,000 adult salmon and steelhead returned to the Snake River to spawn in the 1950s. In 2017, there were less than 10,000. $3.6 billion US spent by the Canadian government to buy Kinder Morgan's Trans Mountain Pipeline. The goal, to expand transport of low-grade tar sands oil from Alberta, Canada to refineries in Northwest Washington. 7 times more oil tankers, each holding 25 million gallons of tar sands oil mixed with volatile organic diluents, including benzene, will travel the Salish Sea if the Trans Mountain Pipeline expands. 0 chance to clean up tar sands oil and protect first responders and marine life from toxic chemicals when tankers spill. Accountable, adjective, responsible, liable, comprehensible, understandable. 1, Canadian Federal Court of Appeal overturned approval of the Trans Mountain Oil Pipeline expansion because the federal government failed to adequately consult First Nations. 44 state, tribal, provincial, and federal officials served on Washington Governor Inslee's Southern Resident Orca Task Force. After 2 years of work in 2019, the task force presented 49 recommendations that will lead to better water quality, a healthier ecosystem, and more robust salmon runs. They dedicated the final report to Tahlequah and to the 2 new orca calves born in 2019. Countless, the efforts to pay our overdue debt to Tahlequah, her calf, and the Salish Sea. That one Canadian federal court of appeal that overturned the approval of the Trans Mountain Pipeline, I had a fun connection with that at a reading I did in Bellingham. A man was in the back of the room and he came up to me afterwards and said that he was one of the attorneys that had worked on that case. And he had just happened to be in Bellingham. He lived in Vancouver. He just happened to be there and just happened to stop in the bookstore and join in on the reading. So that was a real treat to be able to thank him personally for the work that he had done, along with many others, I'm sure. I often hesitate to read that piece because it is quite heavy, but it is part of the message that I wanted to convey in this collection. But I also wanted to lighten the heavy tone, and songs tend to do that even when they give important information. And one piece that I did is a parody of, I don't know if this audience remembers the MTA song about the subway in Boston. And will he ever return? No, he'll never return, the man on the MTA. Once during my residency on the ferry, I got stranded on San Juan Island because there was a big freeze and the ferry dock on Lopez froze and they couldn't land the ferry. So it just kept going to all the other islands, but it couldn't go to Lopez. And so I thought, I feel like the guy on the MTA. So I did a parody of that song with lyrics about that experience, and I called it the WSF song. So that's in there. And then profiles are another form that I enjoy using. My first book was called Hands at Work, and it's a collection of profiles of people who do all kinds of work with their hands. And I met so many people and read so many people, scientists who are doing really important work with the Salish Sea. And so I wrote profiles of a few of them. One is called Wild Sea Doctor, about Joe Gatos, who's the science director of the Sea Dock Society, and he is a marine veterinarian. And then another one is called Everybody Loves a Pooping Whale, and it's about Deborah Giles, who's with the Conservation Canines Program, which is an amazing program that trains dogs to detect whale poop from very far away. And then the scientists can collect the poop and do all kinds of tests to evaluate the health of the whale. And it's totally non-invasive. And these dogs just can smell, from hundreds and hundreds of yards away and get very excited when there's whale poop on the surface of the water. So there are some things that are a little lighter. You'll also find a postcard and a thank you note written by the Southern resident killer whales in this collection. And then another form Jackie and I are going to share with you this evening called an imagined interview. And so Jackie's going to come up and I'll introduce this piece. All of you here know Jackie Haskins, longtime friend, fellow writer, about to have her first book published and poetry collection probably coming out soon. We met each other, the Would-Be Writers Workshop, and felt a kinship in our writing interests and have become friends.
Cheers, cheers, Zoomland.
Yeah.
And Iris hasn't flashed this book enough.
Thank you.
This is
Okay. So I'll explain a little bit more about this piece and the part that Jackie is playing. During my tenure as the writer in residence on the Inter-Island Ferry, I read at least as much as I wrote, filling the gaps in my knowledge about the Salish Sea and climate change. And one author I read hungrily was Rachel Carson, marine scientist, writer, and editor. Perhaps best known for Silent Spring, she also wrote 2 earlier books about the ocean. The first one, Under the Sea Wind in 1941, is an account of interactions of a seabird, a sanderling, a mackerel, and an eel off the Atlantic coast. And then The Sea Around Us in 1951 serves as a biography of the sea and is noted for both its science and its poetic prose. Carson was born in 1907 near heavily industrialized Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, a graduate of Pennsylvania College for Women, now Chatham University. Carson studied at the Woods Hole Marine Biological Laboratory and received an MA in zoology from Johns Hopkins University. In Silent Spring, she continued writing about the interrelationship of all life and revealed the dangers of the pesticide DDT. After the book's publication, she was attacked by the chemical industry and accused by some government leaders as an alarmist. I wish Rachel Carson were still around, perhaps joining me to ride and write on the Tillicum. I've read many of her words and I've imagined what we would talk about. Author Kathleen Dean Moore, quote, interviewed Edward Abbey posthumously in Great Tide Rising. So I borrowed her technique, devising my own questions for Ms. Carson and using her previously published words for her replies. So with Jackie playing Rachel Carson, you can imagine our conversation going something like this. And for those of you who haven't seen the book, all of Rachel Carson's responses to me are from her own writings, and they are footnoted so you can read even more. So here we are. So nice to be able to talk with you. You're a well-respected thinker and writer about conservation, Ms. Carson, and you spent a lot of time studying the sea. What drew you to the ocean?
Oh, as long as I can remember, the sea has fascinated me, Iris. Even as a child, long before I had ever seen it, I used to imagine what it would look like and what the surf would sound like. Since I grew up in an inland community where we hadn't even a migrating seagull, I had to wait a long time to have my curiosity satisfied. As a matter of fact, it wasn't until I had graduated from college and gone to Woods Hole that I saw the ocean. There, I began to get my first real understanding of the real sea world, that is the world as it is known by shorebirds and fishes and beach crabs and all the other creatures that live in the sea or along its edge. All through the long history of Earth, it has been an area of unrest where waves have broken heavily against the land, where the tides have pressed forward over the continents, receded and then returned. Fish, amphibian and reptile, warm-blooded bird and mammal, each of us carries in our veins a salty stream in which the elements sodium, potassium, and calcium are combined in almost the same proportions as in seawater.
Well, I live on an island in the Salish Sea in Washington State, and I never tire of looking at the water's many shades of blue. But I'm embarrassed to admit there's a great deal I don't know about this body of water. For example, what makes it that color?
The sea is blue because the sunlight is reflected back to our eyes from the water molecules or from very minute particles suspended in the sea. In the journey of the light rays downward into the water and back to our eyes, all the red rays of the spectrum and most of the yellow have been absorbed. So it is chiefly the cool blue light that we see.
Well, I feel both fortunate to live so close to the sea and distressed by the visible effects of climate change around me. But so many people don't live anywhere near an ocean. Why should they care?
Even in the vast and mysterious reaches of the sea, we are brought back to the fundamental truth that nothing lives to itself. Water must be thought of in terms of the chains of life that it supports.
At the centennial of your birth, 43 years after your death, the United States House of Representatives passed a resolution in your honor. Here's one portion of the resolution. Resolved that the House of Representatives recognizes that we could learn much from her today, especially as we increasingly feel the effects of climate change and consider measures to lessen and eventually reverse the impact it has on our planet. What do you think is the most important learning that we could gain from you today?
We need to see the problem as a whole, to look beyond the immediate and single event of the introduction of a pollutant into the environment and to trace the chain of events thus set into motion. We must never forget the wholeness of that relationship. We cannot think of the living organism alone, nor can we think of the physical environment as a separate entity. The two exist together, each acting on the other, to form an ecological complex, an ecosystem. With these surface waters, through a series of delicately adjusted interlocking relationships, the life of all parts of the sea is linked. What happens to one diatom in the upper sunlit strata of the sea may well determine what happens to a cod lying on a ledge of some rocky canyon 100 fathoms below, or to a bed of multicolored, gorgeously plumed sea worms carpeting an underlying shoal, or to a prawn creeping over the soft oozes of the seafloor in the blackness of mile-deep water.
Well, it appears the more we learn, the more complicated the natural world is, and the more unattainable real change seems. How did we get here, and how can we change?
We behave not like people guided by scientific knowledge, but more like the proverbial bad housekeeper who sweeps the dirt under the rug in the hope of getting it out of sight. We dump wastes into all kinds of our streams. With the object of having them carried away from our shores, we discharge the smoke and fumes of 1 million smokestacks and burning rubbish heaps into the atmosphere in the hope that the ocean of air is somehow vast enough to contain them. Now, the sea also has become a dumping ground, not only for assorted rubbish, but for the poisonous garbage of the atomic age. And this is done, I repeat, without recognition of the fact that introducing harmful substances into our environment is not a one-step process. It is changing the nature of the complex ecological system and is changing it in ways that we usually do not foresee until it is too late. This lack of foresight is one of the most serious complications, I think. It is not half so important to know as to feel. The more clearly we can focus our attention on the wonders and realities of the universe about us, the less taste we shall have for destruction.
It can be difficult for people to believe that climate change is truly a crisis and that we humans are responsible for it. It's as if we're unwilling or afraid to look at the damage we've caused for decades and continue to wreak. How would you convince us to take this destruction seriously?
I suppose it is rather a new and almost a humbling thought, and certainly one born of this atomic age, that humans could be working against ourselves. In spite of our rather boastful talk about progress and our pride in the gadgets of civilization, there is, I think, a growing suspicion Indeed, perhaps an uneasy certainty that we have been sometimes a little too ingenious for our own good. In spite of the truly marvelous inventiveness of the human brain, we are beginning to wonder whether our power to change the face of nature should not have been tempered with wisdom for our own good and with a greater sense of responsibility for the welfare of generations to come. Contrary to the beliefs that seem often to guide our actions, humans do not live apart from the world. We live in the midst of a complex, dynamic interplay of physical, chemical, and biological forces. And between ourselves and this environment, there are continuing, never-ending interactions. One way to open your eyes is to ask yourself, what if I had never seen this before? Or what if I knew I would never see this again?
In 1952, you received the National Book Award for The Sea Around Us. At the time, it was described as poetic. Do you think of your writing as poetry?
The winds, the sea, the moving tides are what they are. If there is wonder and beauty and majesty in them, science will discover these qualities. If there is poetry in my book about the sea, it is not because I deliberately put it there, but because no one could write truthfully about the sea and leave out the poetry.
I'm deeply grateful for the work you did to raise awareness about the ocean, the danger of pesticides, and environmental protection. Writing personal essays and poems is my response to the climate crisis, but I often question if that's of any use. When did you decide to become a writer, and what are your thoughts about the value of creative writing?
The aim of science is to discover and illuminate truth, and that, I take it, is also the aim of literature. I can remember no time, even in earliest childhood, when I didn't assume I was going to be a writer. A good deal of poetry and stories had been focused on the sea, and quite a bit of science as well, but the best writing combines the two. The books that influence, that push movements forward, are the books that marry science and emotion.
Every day, news reports about repealed environmental policies, extinction of animals, wildfires, oil spills, and rising seas cause fear and wear me and many others down. What advice can you offer to help us keep our spirits up?
Wonder and humility are wholesome emotions, and they do not exist side by side with the lust for destruction. Those who contemplate the beauty of the earth find reserves of strength that will last as long as life lasts. There is something infinitely healing in the repeated refrains of nature. The assurance that dawn comes after night and spring after winter.
How would you describe this present moment when it comes to the climate?
We stand now where two roads diverge. But unlike the roads in Robert Frost's familiar poem, they are not equally fair. The road we have long been traveling is deceptively easy, a smooth superhighway on which we progress with great speed, but at its end lies disaster. The other fork of the road, the one less traveled by, offers our last, our only chance to reach a destination that assures the preservation of the earth.
Thank you.
Iris, it was just a pleasure to meet you.
Very nice to meet you too, Ms. Carson. Thank you so much. This is the second time an event that I've done this. I've had another person portray Rachel Carson, and I'm really glad I've been able to do that because there is an even stronger power in actually hearing those words that she wrote spoken. I didn't read her as a young person. It wasn't anything that any of my teachers taught, and it wasn't anything that we read. We didn't read her in my household. But I'm so grateful that I've gotten to know her through working on this book. And it's really quite, I'm not quite sure what the word is, humbling, distressing, of how prescient she was, and how even those words that Jackie read are 50, 60 years old. They seem as relevant today as they were then. So for my closing excerpt, I'm going to read a piece, and it's in celebration of J37, or Haishka, which is a straight Salish word meaning blessing or thank you, and J59, who is Haishka's baby. And that baby, Southern Resident Whale, was first seen just on March 1st. So it was a great celebration to have another Southern resident born just this spring. And this piece comes in the book's last section on hope. There are several sections in the book, and the last one is on hope. And this is written in 4 very short parts. Each one is numbered, and it has a rather long paragraph and then a single sentence at the end of each one. And it's called Lessons. Number 1, our time. On the first vessel run of the inner island this autumn day, I gather with deckhands in the ferry galley after the final trucks and cars are loaded. Some of the crew pump steaming coffee out of a tall black thermos on the counter. Talk today is about enjoying the quiet of the morning now that the tourists have returned home and most of the drivers and walk-ons are regulars. This is our time now, and I feel that sense of entitlement. Our time, our boat, our Salish Sea. Number 2, ownership. I fuss and fume silently over the sense of ownership, and I wonder, who owns the sea? What does the sea own? Why do we even put any thought into owning what is just here, available and necessary for us, although we aren't so necessary for it? Except now that we've destroyed so much of the life below and above the waterline. 3, imagination. In my imagination, I follow you, Orsinus Orca, as you dive deeper into the sea than I've ever been before, into a darkness darker than I've ever known. So dark I can barely see your white eye patch gleaming against your silky black skin, and I can only feel the other creatures under the water, swimming with you and with me, creatures you know well, but I'm just getting to know, even though they're here all the time, at least for now. 4, renewal. In the Tillicum's main cabin, signs with red letters and diagrams explain the steps in case of an emergency. For the Salish Sea and for us, the emergency alarm has already been sounded. We need to take lessons from the orcapods, travel together in tight groups, some swimming and diving ahead in search of food to pass along to those with fewer reserves, sleep together in a cove in moonlight, celebrate being back together after a time apart, carry our dead as long as we need to, mourn their loss, and then somehow return to frolic, and maybe feel a glimmer of renewal, of hope to carry on. So that gives you a little flavor of the writer in a life vest. So I'd love for us to have some conversation, or people that are viewing can have some conversation. And then we'll also have time for you to stop at the table from a book for all seasons. But I'd be happy to answer questions. I guess people will put questions into chat if there are any, and feel free here to just ask or comment or? Yes. Yes, and that's right. You need to wait until Joshua can bring the microphone over so that it can be audible for the audience too.
Yeah, my question for you is, are you still a writer in residence on the ferry?
No, the plan was for it to be a one-year term. I mean, it was a one-year term. I totally made it up, so it could have been whatever I wanted. But, you know, I did follow, there are many writing residencies all around the world, actually. And usually they're maybe a few months, maybe a year. So I had designed it to be 1 year. And then I put out a call through various avenues for another person to be the writer in residence, and just asked them to describe, you know, what they're writing, why they want to be the writer in residence. It was a very simple application, and but that it would require writing on this particular ferry. And I received a dozen applications, which I thought was quite respectable, given that there was no stipend or anything that often accompanies writing residencies. And so I read through all the applications. They were all really good. I narrowed it down to 3, and then I enlisted the help of my writing group to read those top three in my mind, blind, and they all unanimously agreed on one of them, a woman named Liz Smith from San Juan Island, who is a documentary filmmaker, producer. She worked on, I think it was a National Geographic project of a film about the 10th anniversary of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. And so a lot of her writing is about environmental issues. And she was a producer on a recent documentary film called Youth v. Gov. And it's the story of 20-some young people who were suing the federal government for not assuring access to clean air and water, and their concerns about climate change. Yes, you can now see on net. Is it Netflix? Okay, it's a fantastic documentary. The case has not been settled yet. Who knows? It may end up going to the Supreme Court. But Liz was one of the producers of that and did a lot of research for that film about all of the presidential administrations, the decades of leaders that have made decisions that have put us where we are today. So anyway, Liz seemed like, you know, perfect person to carry on, and she was really eager to do some of her writing on the ferry. And so she began like in January of 2019, and no, 2019. And then a few months later, we know what happened. Was it 2020? Okay. Yes. So COVID happened. And nobody was riding or writing on the ferry. So we said, well, let's, you know, have you just stay in that role for another year. And, you know, it wasn't that much better this year. So meanwhile, she finished this documentary film and, you know, is doing plenty of writing. And she has done some writing on the ferry, but our plan is to put out a call again before the end of the year and see if there's someone who wants to do that starting next year. So if you're a writer and you're interested, it just means getting yourself over to the San Juan Islands. Yeah. But anyway, long answer to your question, but for both Liz and for me, we found it to be a delightful place to write, and passengers were really interested in what we were doing, and because we had our little sign out, and you know, it was kind of a novelty on the ferry to have people doing that. Yeah.
So I know that sometimes after a person writes a book and then a year goes by or time goes by, and then you think, oh, if I could have just added one thing or written one more thing. If there was one more thing you could add to your book now, what might it be?
Oh, gosh. Believe me, I've thought of, there have been many times I have thought, oh, I wish I had done that. And I can't call them all up at the moment. But one thing that has recurred for me is wishing that I had really done more exploration, research, learning about the Coast Salish people's stories and understandings of blackfish, as they call orcas, and that they are salmon people. And I wish I had, I wish I had done some interviews with Coast Salish peoples and shared some of their stories. I mean, I don't know what form it would have taken, but I just feel now that that was really a gap. And so that is one of the things I want to figure out a way to learn more for myself. And if there's some way that through my writing, I can help make that available to people or help them make it available to people, I'd be really interested in that. So thanks for that question, because I have thought about that a number of times. Like every time I read that land acknowledgement is for sure one time. Yeah, thanks. Joshua's getting a workout tonight.
So a comment and then a question. I always appreciate when a scientist or a writer or a documentary filmmaker just pays attention deeply to something and then shares it with us who are, wandering around life this way and that way. So I really appreciate what you did, that you just made a commitment to sit not in one place, but, roaming around and just paying attention to the Salish Sea and sharing that with us. And then bringing Rachel Carson's stories to life was really powerful. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
So I guess two questions. One, is there another topic or place that you're making a commitment to pay attention to? And then secondly, just a different question, just what can we who live farther from the ocean do for the orcas?
Yeah. So your first question about what is next that I might be focusing on, I'm not clear about that at this point. This project really asked a lot of me in a different way from my memoir, which that asks a lot when you write a memoir of revealing yourself. This just asked a lot of me in some different ways. And perhaps some of that was because of our time. Most of my writing of this was during the height of COVID. And so it was just a whole other layer for all of us in anything we were trying to do at the time. So I found I was really pretty worn out after this was finished and now as I'm promoting it. And I don't have clarity about what's next. By the same token, I didn't have clarity that this was going to be next after I finished Hiking Naked. And like many writers, I found myself saying, oh, I don't think I have anything else to say. And, oh, I don't think I'm ever going to write again. And, that didn't happen. So maybe something will become clear. I decided to give myself the time, to see what comes forward and to put some effort into some discernment about that. There certainly is a lot that needs to be said in our world today. And I want to be sure that before I do that, I'm clear what it is I have to say, if there is something for me to say. What was the other thing you just asked me?
What out here can we do?
Oh, yes. I wrote an essay called Vows for the Salish Sea, I think is the name of it. Vows for the Salish Sea. And that was my attempt to to share with readers what I'm personally committed to, in much the way any of us who've made vows for whatever reason do. And some of them are very personal choices that I'm making, and others are more public kinds of things. So that essay might offer some ideas. I wrote them in the form of what I will do and what I won't do. When you make a marriage vow, it's best to be in the positive note of all the things you're going to do. But I think, especially when it comes to climate change, there's some things we need to stop doing. And so I alternate back and forth. I will not. For one is I won't eat Chinook or king salmon. There are other kinds of salmon that aren't endangered, that I can help support my local fisher people by purchasing the fish they catch, and not just add to the demand for Chinook or king salmon. And the reason the southern residents prefer that is it has the highest fat content, which is why we humans probably prefer it too, and why it's so treasured. But I'm not going to eat that whenever I can know what kind of salmon, and usually you can. There's also, I think, growing agreement that the 4 dams on the Snake River really are damaging the Chinook salmon, just in adding to their loss, and that those dams need to come down. It's not universally agreed upon, and it's probably some very different views on the east side of the Cascades as opposed to the west side. But I've been, letting decision makers know my thoughts that those dams need to come down. So, whenever there are opportunities for us to try to influence public policy, just being aware of what we put down into our septic systems and runoff from our yards, and in terms of pesticides. So those are some of the things, on the more positive note. I'm going to continue to study more about salmon habitat and protection. There's so much more to learn. Just continuing to study about climate change and learn what I can, and to really try to amplify the voices of people, particularly people of color, indigenous peoples, who are even more harmed by climate change, and or have wisdom that we need to be paying attention to. And I'll just read this last part, because this was my attempt to be a little poetic like Rachel Carson. I will not take for granted my inhalations spiced with salt, great blue herons squawking at my intrusion, river otters scampering across rocky beaches, the undersea forest of kelp washed up on beaches after a storm, and orcas swishing their tails to balance upright and spy on me. So I think, just being aware and noticing, as you were talking about, is a really important thing to be doing too. I think that we are at our time for me to end, and Gracie's going to say a few words, and you need to get that from Joshua.
Well, thank you all for coming, those of you physically here in person and those virtually online. And thank you so much to Iris for that wonderful presentation and your beautiful, insightful words. I'm Gracie. For those of you who don't know me, I work at A Book for All Seasons, our local independent bookstore, and I'm back here in the back selling books. both of Iris's books that she's got here. And for those online who were not able to be here in person, but still want to purchase them, we will have Writer in a Life Vest for sale at A Book for All Seasons. So once again, thank you so much. If those of you who are here wouldn't mind helping put the chairs away, that would be wonderful and would just help make cleanup a lot easier. Thank you so much for coming once again. And let's do another round of applause for Iris. Thank you. Oh, and I would also like to thank Wenatchee River Institute for inviting the bookstore to be a part of this. We really appreciate the partnership. So thank you.